Have you ever felt like you were alive but completely invisible inside your own home? Like every step you took, every breath, every word was an inconvenience to someone you once carried in your arms? I lived like that for 18 years. And the worst part? It wasn't a stranger who made me feel that way. It was my own son. My name is Eleanor Parker. I'm 73 years old today. I've been through many things in this life. But this experience nearly broke me in silence. It wasn't just suffering. It was the erasure of my existence. And I want to tell you everything. Because sometimes the deepest pain doesn't scream. It whispers every single day inside you. It was a humid July morning in a small town in Georgia called Dalton. I remember the strong smell of burnt coffee on the stove, the constant hum of an old oscillating fan in the corner of the living room, and the creaking of the wooden floor under my tired feet. The sun had barely risen, but I was already up, tidying the kitchen and picking up clothes off the couch, like I did every single day. Because Alexei, my only son, never lifted a finger to help. I had moved into that house after my husband, Harold, passed away from a heart attack nearly 20 years ago. Alexei, who was unemployed at the time, asked to move in with me temporarily until he got back on his feet. Temporary turned into permanent. Over time, he just stopped trying. No job hunting, no cleaning, no responsibilities, not even washing a single plate. But the worst part wasn't even that. It was the way he talked to me. You're pathetic, Mom. Nobody wants you around. Useless old woman. Stop walking around like some lost insect. Why are you getting dressed? Up? Who do you think is going to look at you? Those words. They piled up inside me like dust settling in the corners of a house no one's cleaned in years. At first, I thought he was just stressed. Then I convinced myself maybe I had failed as a mother. Maybe he was right. I started believing his words. And that was the most dangerous thing. He never hit me. He never raised a hand. But every sentence was a blow, a cut that turned into a wound. Before I knew it, I wasn't leaving the house. I wasn't answering the phone. My church friends stopped calling after too many ignored invitations. My world shrank to that bitter silence, the smell of mildew in the poorly kept house, and the sound of the front door slamming when Alexei barged into my room to demand money. And I gave it. He took out loans in my name. Many. He asked for my bank card, saying he'd handle things, and I, too afraid to provoke him, handed it over. I ended up with debt collectors calling, letters in the mail every day. I remember one with red letters stamped on the envelope. Final notice before legal. Action. My hands trembled, just holding it. But I couldn't tell anyone. Because who would believe me? A woman in her 70s claiming to be a prisoner in her own home, by her own child. The worst part was the silence in the walls. The way he'd walk past me like I wasn't there. Even the days he was calm made me anxious, because I knew it would turn again. It always did. One night, I sat in the armchair by the window, looking out at the garden. There was a small rose bush, Harold's, that I always took care of. It was my last connection to something beautiful. That day I saw it wilting, and I realized, even that, I didn't have the strength to keep alive anymore. I thought, is this how I'll end my days? Slowly fading away and no one noticing? But deep inside, a voice still whispered, A part of me was screaming for help, for life. And it was there, in that suffocating, silent night, that my story began to change. Not overnight, not magically, but with a decision. I would not accept this as normal anymore. If this grandma's story is touching your heart, leave a like. It really helps the channel and shows that you want to hear more real stories like this. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss any of the upcoming stories. And if you know someone who needs to hear something like this, share it. Sometimes a simple story can change an entire day. Thank you for being here and listening with your heart. Remember exactly the day I started lifting my head again. It wasn't easy. I had spent years feeling like a shadow inside that house, but in that hot, buzzing night, with the sound of cicadas outside and the ticking of the clock filling the silence, I decided I couldn't live like that anymore. Not just for me, but for the woman I used to be. The first step was small, but to me it felt like climbing a mountain. I called an old church friend named Margaret. She lived about 40 minutes away in a neighboring town called Chatsworth. I hadn't spoken to her in nearly 10 years. My hand shook so badly I could barely dial the number. When she answered and said, "Hello?" I couldn't speak. I cried silently for almost a full minute before I finally whispered, "Hi, Maggie. It's me, Eleanor." She paused, and then, in that warm voice I remembered, she said, "Oh my God, Eleanor, I thought you had moved away. We've missed you so much." I couldn't tell her everything right away. I just said I needed someone to talk to. And she, without hesitation, said, "Whenever you want. My home is open." That gave me a tiny thread of hope. But the hardest part was still ahead, facing Alexei. That morning, when he came downstairs with his usual scowl, like the world owed him something, I took a deep breath and said, "Today I'm going to visit Margaret." He looked at me with disgust, dropped his backpack on the floor, and snapped, "And who's gonna pay for the gas? Where are you getting money from, huh? You don't even know what you're doing, Mom." That phrase, "You don't even know what you're doing." I'd heard it 100 times, maybe more. It was his way of making me feel small, incapable, weak. But this time, something inside me didn't bow down. I just replied, "I know exactly what I'm doing. I'm taking a step toward feeling alive again." He scoffed and stomped upstairs. I stood there, heart pounding, hands cold. But I had said my first no. And even if it was small, it echoed through me like a scream of freedom. Later that day, I checked the mailbox. A thick envelope waited. Inside, yet another credit card bill. In my name, for purchases I never made. Video games, fast food, expensive clothes I'd never seen. It was him. Again. Back in the kitchen, I sat at the table and stared at the paper like it was a verdict. I was shaking with anger and fear. But for the first time, I didn't cry. I picked up the phone and called the bank. A young woman named Julia answered. She listened to me for over 30 minutes. I told her about the debt, about how my son had been using my personal information. She was kind, human. She said she'd file a report and that I could, yes, contest the charges. It was the first time in years I felt believed. That night, Alexei barged into my room again, as usual, without knocking. He rummaged through drawers, grabbed my phone and said, "I need your bank code. I've got a bill to pay." But this time I said, "Not today. That's my money, my account." He froze, stared at me with disbelief and anger. "You challenging me now?" My voice trembled, but I said, "It's not a challenge. It's a boundary, one I should have set a long time ago." He threw the phone on the bed and stormed out. I closed the door behind him and took a deep breath. For the first time in many years, I went to sleep feeling something I had nearly forgotten: dignity. The next morning, I wrote 3 sentences on a piece of paper and stuck it to the fridge with a little apple magnet. You have value. You are not alone. You do not deserve to live in fear. Those words became my shield, day after day. With each small act, I was reclaiming pieces of the woman I used to be. The woman who sewed her daughter's dresses by hand, who made apple pies Harold loved, who sang in the church choir. She was still in me, hurt but alive, and for the first time in a long time, I believed I could be whole again. The next few days after that small act of defiance felt like walking on shattered glass. Every step was painful, uncertain. I expected Alexei to explode at any moment. I tiptoed around the house, waiting for the storm to come. But strangely, he went quiet. Not calm, just quiet. That kind of silence that coils around you like a snake, slow and suffocating. You never know when it'll strike. Still, I held my ground. I began waking up earlier, not because he asked me to, but because I wanted time alone before his presence darkened the house. I'd sit on the back porch with my coffee. Not instant, the real one, from ground beans I bought with what little money I still had hidden. The breeze in the early morning was cool against my skin, the sky a soft pink before the sun peeked over the horizon. And for those brief moments, I felt like myself again. Then one morning, as I was folding some laundry, I found one of my old journals buried in a drawer. It was small, leather-bound, with yellowed pages and a faint smell of lavender. I used to keep a sachet tucked inside. I opened it and started reading entries from decades ago. Entries full of joy, of recipes, of silly things my daughter used to say before she moved away. I had almost forgotten who that woman was. But reading those words, I met her again. And I realized she never really left. I had just been drowning in someone else's chaos. That night, while Alexei was locked in, his room, his door always shut, the light of his computer flickering under the crack, I sat at the kitchen table with that journal. I wrote something new for the first time in years. Today I said no, not out of anger, out of love, for myself. I think that's something worth writing down. The next morning, I received a call from Margaret. She said, "Honey, I couldn't sleep after we talked. I kept thinking about you. Are you okay?" "Really okay?" I hesitated, but then I said it out loud for the first time. "No, I'm not okay, Maggie. I haven't been okay in years." She didn't ask questions. She just said, "I'm coming to see you this weekend. We'll sit and talk, maybe cry a little, and maybe laugh a little too." That small promise filled me with something I hadn't felt in so long: anticipation. Not fear of what Alexei might say, not dread of another empty day, but the real kind, the kind where you're looking forward to something. But when Saturday came, and Margaret knocked on the door with a bag of cookies and a heart full of kindness. Alexei opened it before I could. He stared at her like she was an intruder. "Who the hell are you?" he asked, blocking the entrance. Margaret, bless her brave soul, didn't flinch. She smiled politely and said, "I'm Eleanor's friend. We have plans." He turned to look at me, his face already darkening. "You didn't say you invited people over." And I stood up straighter than I had in years. "I don't need your permission to see my friends, Alexei." His eyes narrowed, jaw clenched. But Margaret stepped in before he could say more. "I'm just here to visit, nothing more. Why don't you go take a break? Let your mother have some company." He scoffed and walked back upstairs, slamming his door. The house vibrated with the force. But once we were alone, something shifted. Margaret and I sat in the living room, the same one I had tiptoed through like a ghost for years. She looked around and said gently, "This house feels heavy, Eleanor." I nodded. "It's been that way for a long time." She didn't press. She just placed her hand over mine and I broke. The tears came, messy, loud, ugly. Years of silence melted away into sobs that shook my whole chest. "I've been so alone," I whispered. "So afraid." And I thought, maybe I deserved it. Margaret's voice was steady, calm. "No one deserves to feel that way, especially not you." That conversation opened a dam inside me. For the first time, I shared everything. The manipulation, the fear, the financial abuse. I told her about the credit card debt, the insults, the isolation. Every shameful, painful detail. And Margaret didn't judge. She didn't pity me. She listened. Truly listened. Like a friend should. Before she left, she hugged me tight and said, "You're not powerless. You just forgot how strong you are. Let me help you remember." That night, I slept with the journal beside my pillow. I wrote one more thing before closing my eyes. Help has a face now, and her name is Margaret. The following week, something inside me began to truly shift. Not in a loud or dramatic way. It was quieter than that. Like the slow thaw of ice after a long, merciless winter. Every little act of resistance against the silence I had lived in felt like planting a seed, though I didn't know yet what might grow from it. Margaret started calling every morning, just to check on me. Her voice became like the sunrise. Warm, predictable, reassuring. She never asked too many questions. She just made sure I knew someone was there. But Alexei noticed the change. He started acting different, not better, just more watchful. Like he could sense I was pulling away from the orbit he'd forced me into for so many years. One morning, I caught him standing in the hallway, just outside the kitchen, listening while I spoke to Margaret on the phone. I hung up quickly and pretended not to see him. He said nothing, just walked past me, slowly, eyes narrowed. But that silence was thick with warning. I wish I could say I wasn't afraid. But I was. That afternoon, I walked into my bedroom and saw my purse dumped upside down on the bed. My wallet open. My documents scattered. I knew immediately he'd been looking for my bank info again. I gathered everything, heart racing, and hid the important papers inside an old shoebox that I tucked beneath a loose floorboard in the closet. My hands shook the entire time. I sat down on the edge of the bed, knees trembling, and thought, this isn't a home. This is a cage. And yet, despite everything, something deeper than fear began to stir. A kind of protective anger. Not the wild kind that burns everything. No. This was different. It was the quiet kind. The kind that builds slowly, fiercely. Like roots wrapping around rock. I called the local community center, the one downtown near the library. They had free counseling services for seniors. It took me days to build up the courage, but finally, I left the house alone, for the first time in months. I took the bus. Just getting on it made me feel like I was learning to breathe again. Cha Tai Di. Center was quiet and smelled faintly of cinnamon and old books. The counselor's name was Denise. She was maybe in her 40s. Kind eyes, soft voice. She sat across from me with a notepad and said, "Whenever you're ready, just tell me a little bit about why you're here." I sat in silence for what felt like forever. Then I finally said, "My name is Eleanor, and I don't remember the last time I felt safe." Her expression didn't change, no shock, no pity. Just a nod and a soft, "That's a good place to start." For 45 minutes, I poured out the truth. How the abuse started small. How I kept excusing it. How it wore me down year after year. And how eventually, I stopped being me. When I finished, Denise said something that stuck with me. When people talk about domestic abuse, they picture bruises. But words and fear, they can leave wounds no one sees, and those can take the longest to heal. But you, Eleanor, you've already begun. Walking back to the bus stop that day, I looked up at the sky and smiled. Just a little. The clouds were clearing, and for once, I didn't rush home. I took my time. I stopped at the park bench I used to visit with Harold. I ran my hand along the metal armrest, worn and cool to the touch. I sat for nearly half an hour, just being. When I returned home, Alexei was in the living room, arms crossed. "Where the hell were you?" he asked sharply. I looked him in the eye. "Out." "Out where?" "That's not your business," I said calmly. He sneered. "You think you can just come and go now?" And I said, "Yes, I can. Because this is my house, and I am not your prisoner." He didn't know what to say. I saw the shock ripple across his face. Maybe, for the first time, he realized I meant it. That I wasn't afraid of the silence anymore. That I was building a life outside of him. That night, I didn't lock my bedroom door. Not because I trusted him, but because I refused to live in fear of it any longer. I kept a small flashlight and my cell phone by my side, just in case. But mostly I just breathed easier. In my journal, I wrote, "He saw the door open today and it scared him, but it gave me air." In the days that followed, something strange started to happen. I began remembering who I was before fear became my everyday companion. It didn't come all at once. It was like catching glimpses of a reflection you hadn't seen in years. Blurry at first, but slowly sharpening into focus. I opened the old photo albums again. Dust covered the leather covers, and some pages stuck together, warped by time and humidity. But there they were, pieces of my old life. Me holding baby Alexei on a beach in Myrtle Beach. Harold kissing me on the cheek in our tiny kitchen. Flour on my nose from baking. Our daughter Emily wearing a Halloween costume I'd sewn by hand. God, how I'd loved being a mother. But motherhood, when you give and never protect your own soul, can break you. I stared at those pictures for hours, cried quietly, laughed a little too, especially at the ones where my hair was a disaster or where the dog had photobombed us. I saw in those photos a woman who was soft but strong. I wanted to be her again, or maybe just remember that I never stopped being her. I had only been buried under years of guilt and obligation. One photo in particular hit me like a punch to the chest. It was Alexei, at maybe 10 years old, holding up a crayon drawing he'd made for Mother's Day. In it, he'd drawn me with a cape and a huge smile. At the bottom, in crooked letters, it said, "To my hero, Mommy." I pressed that photo to my heart and wept. That little boy. Where had he gone? Was it me who failed him? Had I missed something, some early sign, some red flag? The questions were endless, and the guilt stabbed deep. But Denise, my counselor, told me something that helped silence those thoughts. "Eleanor," she said, "love and responsibility don't mean surrendering your dignity. You didn't fail him by being kind. You only began to lose yourself when you stopped being kind to yourself." That hit me harder than anything I'd heard in years. I decided to make one more change. Small, but meaningful. I cleared out the guest room. It had been used as a storage dump for years, filled with old boxes, forgotten furniture, and all the emotional clutter of a life paused. It took me 3 days to clean it out, bag by bag, memory by memory. I found old letters from friends I hadn't spoken to in over a decade, a church hymnal from the choir I used to lead, even a box of fabric scraps and thread from when I still used to sew dresses and pillowcases. The work was exhausting, but it didn't feel like a chore. It felt like I was digging my way back to myself. When I was done, I opened the windows wide and let the fresh air pour in. I even bought new curtains, just light, soft ones from the dollar store, and put fresh sheets on the bed. I didn't know why at first. Maybe because a clean space meant possibility. Or maybe, somewhere deep inside, I was preparing for a life where someone could visit me again, where I could have a friend over, without fear or shame. That same evening, Alexei walked past the room and paused. He leaned against the doorway and said, "What's this for? Planning to rent it out or something?" I didn't even look up from the bed I was tucking. "No," I said. "I'm reclaiming it." He snorted. "You're acting weird, you know that? Like all this cleaning and smiling. You think you're special or something?" I turned to him, not with anger, not with fear, with clarity. I don't need to be special. I just need to be free. He left without saying a word, and for once, I didn't care what he was thinking. I was too busy feeling the cool evening breeze drifting through the open window, fluttering the new curtains like soft wings. Later, Margaret called again. I told her about the room, about the photos, about the guest bed made up with fresh linens. And she said something so simple, so beautiful, that I wrote it down immediately. "It sounds like your soul is making space for peace." That night, I made tea, real tea, not just a dusty old bag and a chipped mug. I lit a small candle I had tucked away for years, and I sat at the kitchen table and wrote, "Today, I made room, for air, for hope, for whatever may come." And then I looked around that kitchen, once silent and heavy with sorrow, and whispered to myself, "I'm coming back, piece by piece. There are moments in life when you feel something click inside, like a door finally locking or unlocking, after years of being stuck. That week, something clicked in me. I'd spent so long surviving on instinct, on guilt, on duty, that I had forgotten what it meant to choose. But now, every little choice, to open a window, to speak a truth, to say no, felt like a revolution. I decided to call my daughter. Emily and I hadn't spoken in nearly 5 years. Not because of a fight, not even out of anger, but because I was too ashamed. Ashamed to tell her the truth. I used to make excuses. She's busy with her own family. She doesn't need to worry about me. It's just a rough patch. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I was afraid she'd hear in my voice the woman I'd become. Weak, worn down, unrecognizable. But that day I picked up the phone anyway. Her voice when she answered was cautious. "Hello?" I almost hung up. But then I said softly, "Emily, it's Mom." There was a long pause, the kind of pause that holds too many years, too many unsaid things. Then she breathed out, and I heard her voice shake. "Mom, oh my God, are you okay? Where have you been?" I broke. The tears came fast, like a dam finally giving way. "I've been here," I whispered, "but I haven't been me for a long time." She didn't press. She just said, "I'm so glad you called. I've missed you." We talked for nearly an hour. I didn't tell her everything yet. Not about the loans, the emotional abuse, the silence in the walls. But I told her enough. Enough for her to say, "Mom, whatever's going on, I'm here now. You don't have to go through this alone, anymore." I hung up the phone with trembling hands, but a weight had lifted. I had spoken. I had reached out. And the world hadn't ended. In fact, for the first time, it felt like something had begun. But Alexei felt the shift too. He started picking more fights, often over nothing. One morning, I left the television on while I cleaned, just to hear some voices in the house that weren't his. He came downstairs furious. "Why is that so loud? You trying to drive me insane now?" I didn't flinch. I turned it down, but didn't turn it off. I looked him in the eye and said, "I like the sound. It reminds me I'm not alone." He stared at me like I'd grown 2 heads. "You're not alone because I'm here, Mom. I live here." "No," I replied. "You occupy space here. That's not the same as presence." That shut him up. For a minute. Later that day, he demanded my car keys. Said he had errands. But I had already hidden them. The car was in my name, bought with the last bit of savings Harold and I had tucked away years ago. "Where are the damn keys?" he barked. I looked him square in the face. "Not with you, not anymore." His face turned red, fists clenched. For a split second, I wondered if he would throw something, yell louder, slam a door, but he didn't. He just stormed out of the house, cursing under his breath. When the door slammed behind him, I let myself crumble, but only for a moment. Then I stood up, walked over to the window, and watched the wind shake the trees. The sky was gray, and a storm was clearly coming. But I felt stronger than I had in years. That evening, I did something radical. I wrote down every debt in my name, every credit card, every loan. every utility bill that had been inflated by Alexei's lifestyle. I spread them out on the kitchen table, one by one, like puzzle pieces of the life I'd allowed to spiral out of control. It was overwhelming, but it was also clarifying, because now I could see it, I could plan, I could fight. I called Denise the next morning and asked her about financial counseling. She referred me to a legal aid group that helped elderly victims of economic abuse. The woman I spoke with was named Carla. She had a warm voice and sharp mind. "You're not the first mother this has happened to," she said. "And sadly, you won't be the last. But you're taking steps now. That matters." I started the process of freezing my credit. I filed a fraud claim. I began gathering evidence, phone records, emails, transactions. I even printed out the delivery receipts from the online orders Alexei had made in my name, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long, long time. Prepared. Margaret came over that weekend with fresh bread and a thermos of soup. When she saw all the papers spread across the table, she smiled and said, "You're not just surviving anymore. You're reclaiming." We sat and ate together, like old friends, and for the first time, I told her what Alexei had said to me when he was 13, the first time he ever called me worthless. How I laughed it off back then, how I excused it as a teenage phase. But how that word had stayed with me, echoed inside my head. Margaret reached across the table, squeezed my hand and said, "You are not worthless. You are rising. And he knows it. That's why he's afraid." That night, I took a long shower, washed my hair with the good shampoo I'd been saving, put on my favorite old nightgown, the blue one with little embroidered flowers. I lit a candle again and opened the window, and I slept with the breeze against my face, not because I was trying to feel something different, but because I finally was. It was a Tuesday morning when it all came to a head, the kind of morning that starts out quiet, deceptively so. The sky outside was a soft, hazy blue, the kind that usually gives me peace. I was sitting at the kitchen table, sorting through paperwork, a cup of coffee steaming by my elbow. My phone buzzed with a message from Carla at Legal Aid. She said the credit freeze was officially processed. One less way for Alexei to control me. I exhaled slowly and whispered to myself, "Good." But peace doesn't last long when someone's used to chaos and control. Alexei came downstairs later than usual. He looked groggy, like he hadn't slept, and he was already angry. I could tell by the heaviness in his steps, the slump of his shoulders, the twitch in his jaw. He didn't say, "Good morning." He never did any more. He walked straight to the fridge, pulled it open, and slammed it shut. "No orange juice? Seriously?" "I didn't go shopping," I said calmly. "Obviously," he muttered. "What do you even do all day?" It was a line I'd heard before, a test, a jab. He wanted me to react, to retreat, but I didn't. "I take care of myself," I replied. Finally, he laughed, sharp and bitter. "Is that what this is? Taking care of yourself? Sitting around, playing old lady with your friend on the phone? Freezing my accounts?" I froze. So he knew. He stepped closer. "I tried to order lunch yesterday and couldn't even use the card." "What the hell did you do, Mom?" I met his eyes. I protected what's mine. For a second, I thought he might throw something. His fists clenched. His face turned a shade of red I hadn't seen before. He stepped toward me, towering. This man I once rocked to sleep, who now looked at me like I was the enemy. "You're ruining everything," he spat. I stood my ground. "No, Alexei, you did. For 18 years you lived here without respect, without kindness, without a shred of responsibility. And I let it happen. I blamed myself, made excuses, tried to love you through it. But love isn't slavery, and I'm done being your prisoner." Silence. The kind of silence that follows a door slamming shut inside the soul. Then, he turned and left. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. He just grabbed his keys, slammed the front door, and drove off. I didn't know where he went. I didn't care. I sat back down at the table and felt my whole body trembling. But it wasn't fear. It was release. The kind of shaking that comes when the chains are finally gone. I called Margaret. "I think it's happening," I said. "What is?" "The end, or maybe the beginning." She came over that evening and stayed for dinner. We made grilled cheese, sandwiches like kids, laughed at nothing, and then sat on the porch swing as the sky turned gold. The air smelled like honeysuckle and fresh grass. For a while we didn't say anything. Just rocked gently, back and forth. Then I asked her, "Do you think I was a bad mother?" She looked at me with such gentleness it almost broke me. "No. I think you were a good mother who forgot she was also a person. And now that you're remembering, that's the most loving thing you can do." I cried again. I've done that a lot lately. Not from weakness, but from the weight leaving me. I let the tears fall, warm on my cheeks, while the last light faded from the sky. Later that night, I received a text from Alexei. "I won't be home tonight. Don't wait up." I stared at it for a while, then deleted it. That same night, I took the guest room and made it mine. I moved my things slowly. Folded shirts, a framed photo of Harold, my sewing kit, my Bible. The old bedroom, the one where I spent all those silent nights, felt like a tomb. I left it as it was, like closing the chapter on a life I no longer claimed. The new room smelled of lavender and light. I lit a candle and opened the window, just a crack. Then I wrote in my journal, "I don't know where he went. I don't know what happens next. But for the first time in almost 2 decades, I'm not afraid to find out." The morning after, Alexei didn't come home. The house was quieter than it had been in years. Not the kind of quiet that presses down on you. The one I'd gotten used to, heavy and suffocating. This quiet felt like space, like air, like a house exhaling after holding its breath for too long. I made coffee and drank it slowly by the window. The birds outside chirped without hurry, without fear, and for once I didn't feel like I had to rush into my day. There was no door slamming upstairs, no footsteps pacing, no passive-aggressive remarks floating down the hallway. Just stillness and peace. I stood in the center of the living room and looked around like I was seeing it for the first time. The furniture hadn't changed. The couch still had the worn armrest. The rug was still a little crooked in the corner, and the clock still ticked unevenly on the wall. But it felt different, like the energy had shifted. The shadows weren't as thick. The corners didn't feel like hiding places anymore. I went to the cabinet and pulled out a tablecloth I hadn't used since Harold passed. Blue and white, with tiny roses embroidered on the edges. I laid it on the dining table, smoothed it out with my palms, and smiled. It was such a small thing, and yet it felt like claiming sacred ground. Later that morning, I went to the spare room, my room now, and opened the sewing kit I hadn't touched in more than a decade. My hands hesitated at first. The thread felt stiff, the scissors a little rusted, but the muscle memory was still there. I threaded a needle with shaking fingers and began mending an old pillowcase with a tear down one side. Stitch by stitch, I felt like I was piecing myself back together too. When I finished, I held the fabric up to the light and said out loud, "Look, Harold, it's not perfect, but it's mine." That night I made a real dinner. Roasted vegetables, garlic bread, a little pasta. Nothing fancy, but everything homemade. I played music on the old stereo in the kitchen, something soft and slow. I sang along under my breath while stirring the sauce, just like I used to, when Emily was little and would dance around in her socks. And then I set the table for two. Not because I expected anyone, but because I wanted to remember what it felt like to prepare space, to expect joy, even if it didn't walk through the door. But something happened later that evening. Just as I was drying the last dish, the front door opened. Alexei walked in. He looked tired. Not angry, not volatile, just worn down. He stood in the doorway like a stranger who didn't quite know if he belonged. "I just came to get a few things," he said. No venom in his voice. Just flat. I didn't answer. I dried the plate in my hands and placed it gently in the cabinet. "I'm not staying," he added. Still, I said nothing. I watched him as he moved to the stairs and disappeared into the room he'd turned into his fortress for years. A few minutes later, he came down carrying a duffel bag. "I'll be crashing at a friend's for now." I nodded. He stood there, unsure of what to say. Maybe he expected me to cry. Maybe he thought I'd beg. Maybe he was even hoping for a fight, something to remind him that he still had power. But I just looked at him and said, "I hope you figure yourself out, Alexei." He blinked. That hit him. Then, before he left, he paused and mumbled, "You really don't need me, huh?" I held his gaze. I needed the version of you who used to draw me pictures and call me his hero. But I learned to need myself more. He left without saying another word. The door clicked shut, not slammed, not forced, just closed. And in that moment, something inside me broke wide open. Not from grief, from release. I didn't cry that night. Instead, I opened every window in the house. I let the breeze sweep through every room, lifting the curtains and carrying out the last of the stale, heavy air that had lived here too long. I turned on every light. I walked from room to room, touching every doorknob, every picture frame, every chipped windowsill, as if blessing the space. I was alone in the house. But I didn't feel lonely. I felt present. I made myself a cup of tea, sat on the back porch with my journal, and wrote for almost an hour. I wrote about guilt and forgiveness, about Harold, about the woman I had been, and the one I was becoming again. I ended with, "Today, he walked out, and I stayed standing." That's all I need to know. The next few weeks passed like pages turning in a book I'd forgotten how to read. Slow, gentle, a little creased at the edges, but rich with feeling. Alexei didn't come back. He texted once or twice, short, cold updates. "I'm staying, with Nate, I'll pick up the rest of my stuff next week. Don't worry about me." I answered only once, with a single sentence. "I do hope you find peace. But I can no longer be your shelter from yourself." And with that, the dialogue ended. My days started to feel mine again. I began waking up early, not from tension, but from eagerness. I'd stretch in bed and actually smile to myself, a habit that surprised me every time it happened. I'd forgotten how much I used to enjoy mornings, the stillness of the house, the way sunlight pooled across the floorboards like warm paint. I started walking again, just around the block at first. The air in Dalton had that sticky Georgia sweetness to it, especially in spring. Azaleas bloomed on every corner, pink and white and bold. I passed the old bakery Harold used to love, and one day, I even went inside. The girl behind the counter was no more than 20, bright-eyed and cheerful. "Morning, ma'am. What can I get for you today?" The ma'am made me smile. I hadn't been called that with such respect in a long time. "I'll have a cinnamon roll," I said, "and a coffee with real cream." I sat by the window, watching cars pass and birds hop along the sidewalk, and I thought, I'm 60 miles from the nearest ocean, but this feels like breathing fresh air again. That night, I got another call from Emily. She had tears in her voice this time. "Mom, I've been thinking about you every day since you called, and I realized I should have done more. I should have visited, should have asked. You couldn't have known," I told her gently. "I was hiding, even from myself." She paused. "Can I come see you? Maybe bring the kids?" My heart swelled in a way I wasn't ready for. I hadn't heard my grandchildren's laughter in years, only through background noise on the phone, muffled and distant. "Yes," I whispered. "Please come." When the day came, I was nervous. I cleaned the house from top to bottom, not out of shame, but because I wanted it to feel like a home again. I put fresh flowers in the old glass vase, baked Harold's favorite lemon loaf, and even laid out the guest towels I'd kept stored for someday. And then I heard it, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Children's voices. A car door slamming, quick footsteps on the gravel path. I opened the front door and there she was, Emily, standing on the porch, holding her daughter's hand, eyes wide and soft. "Hi, Mom," she said, voice cracking. I didn't say a word. I just stepped forward and wrapped my arms around her. We stood there for a long time, just breathing each other in. Her children, Grace and Matthew, hung back shyly, unsure of what to do. And then Grace, with her big brown eyes, whispered, "Are you Grandma Eleanor?" I nodded, smiling through tears. "Yes, sweet pea, I am." They stayed for the whole weekend. We cooked, played board games, laughed until our sides hurt. On Saturday night, we made a blanket fort in the living room, something I hadn't done in decades. I watched Grace crawl inside with a flashlight and a book, giggling the whole time. And something cracked open in me again. Not pain this time. Joy. Real, uncontaminated joy. Emily and I sat on the porch that night, just the two of us. She took my hand and said, "I don't know everything that happened, and I won't push you to tell me unless you want to. But whatever it was, I can see you now. The real you. And I missed her." I looked up at the stars and whispered, "I missed her too." We sat in silence, the kind of silence that feels warm, not empty. The breeze lifted our hair, and for the first time in years, I felt like time wasn't something chasing me, but something I was living inside of again. After they left, the house didn't feel empty. It felt blessed, filled with the echo of little feet, of laughter, of healing. I stood in the middle of the living room and said out loud, "You're welcome here. Love is welcome here. Life is welcome here." I started volunteering at the community center once a week. Just small things, organizing donations, sorting clothes, sometimes sitting and talking with other women my age who were feeling invisible. And every time I told them even a small piece of my story, their eyes lit up, as if to say, "Me too." I thought I was the only one. I wasn't. None of us are. I wrote in my journal that night. I was broken, yes, but not destroyed. I have cracks. But the light gets in now. It was a Sunday morning just after sunrise when I found the old wooden box tucked away in the attic. I hadn't been up there in years. The air was musty, filled with the scent of dry wood and forgotten seasons. Dust floated in narrow beams of sunlight that cut through the slats of the old windows. I'd gone up to find an old quilt I wanted to give to Grace. But what I found instead was something I'd buried not in dust, but in fear. The box was small. Dark cherry wood, scuffed at the corners, with a brass latch that still worked after all these years. Inside were letters, dozens of them. Most were from Harold. Little notes he used to write me before we were married, folded in neat squares, still smelling faintly of his aftershave. I smiled through tears as I read the one where he said, "You make even Tuesday feel like magic." But at the bottom, there was a different letter, one I recognized immediately, not by its handwriting, but by the ache it carried. It was from Alexei. He must have written it after Emily left for college. His words were clumsy, the paper stained in places. It began with, "I don't know how to talk to you anymore. I don't know if I ever really did." The letter wasn't an apology. Not exactly. But it was a glimpse into a boy who had once needed love and never learned how to ask for it without hurting others. He wrote about feeling invisible after Harold died, about hating how much attention I gave to everyone but him, about how being angry made him feel alive, and how he didn't know how to stop. I sat on the attic floor for a long time, that letter in my lap, my hands trembling. And for the first time, I didn't feel hate. I felt grief. I felt release. Understood something that had taken me a lifetime to accept. His wounds weren't my fault, but neither was my silence his responsibility. I climbed down from the attic slowly, sunlight warming my shoulders as I went. I placed the letter in my journal, right next to the page where I had written months ago. Today, he walked out, and I stayed standing. It didn't erase anything. It didn't undo the years of harm, but it gave shape to the pain. And with shape comes edges, and with edges comes the power to let go. That afternoon, I wrote him a letter of my own. I didn't write it to send. I wrote it to say what I needed to say, fully, finally, with no fear of response. It read, "Dear Alexei, loved you from the moment I felt you kick inside me. That love has never left. But the version of it that allowed me to disappear had to die. You hurt me. You emptied me. You broke more than my spirit. You broke the part of me that believed love alone could save someone. But now I see love differently. Love is not a chain. It is not silence. It is not debt or guilt or sacrifice without reciprocity. It is presence. It is respect. It is freedom. You did not give me that, and I allowed it for too long. But no more. I hope you heal. I hope you find your way to whatever man you were meant to become. But I will not open my door to the version of you that lived here. That door is closed. I am not your home anymore. I am my own. Mom, I folded the letter and placed it under a smooth stone in the garden, the one where Harold and I once planted sunflowers. It felt right somehow, like burying a ghost. That night, I invited Margaret over for tea. We sat in the living room, feet curled under our legs, two old women who had seen enough pain to last several lifetimes, and still, we laughed. Still, we drank from the pretty cups. Still, we planned to visit the farmer's market next Saturday. You're different now, she said, watching me over the rim of her teacup. I know, I smiled. I feel it. It's quiet in here, not empty, just peaceful. She nodded. You earned that peace, Eleanor. You didn't wait for someone to give it to you. You built it. That night, I went to bed early. I curled into my new room with my freshly washed quilt and the windows cracked open. I listened to the sound of crickets outside, to the rustle of the trees, and I whispered into the stillness, "You did it. You came back." If someone had told me 5 years ago that I'd be sitting on this same porch, watching the sunset and smiling without fear, I would have laughed. Not because I didn't want it, but because I couldn't imagine it. Back then, hope felt like a luxury I no longer deserved. My heart had shrunk to fit inside a single room, afraid to beat too loudly. But now I let it echo through the whole house. It's strange how life returns to you in pieces, not all at once, not in a grand moment of fireworks and trumpets, but in the softest ways. Like finding yourself humming while folding laundry, like walking into a grocery store and not flinching when someone looks at you, like sitting in silence, real, true silence, and not mistaking it for loneliness. I still have bad days. There are mornings when the weight of the past clings to me like a fog. Sometimes I find myself going quiet when I hear a man's voice, raised in a grocery store. Sometimes I wake from dreams that leave me breathless, memories I never invited back. But then I take a walk. I call Margaret. I play an old gospel hymn and let the music fill the hollow places. I remind myself, I am not what happened to me. I am what I chose to become after it. The community center asked me to lead a small support group for older women, just once a week. At first I said no. I was afraid, not of speaking, but of remembering, of having to name things I spent decades trying to hide. But Denise, my counselor, said, sometimes the wounds we hide become the stories that set others free. So I said, yes. The first meeting was small, 4 women, all different, but all carrying the same invisible burden. One had a son who refused to speak to her. Another was living with a controlling husband. One was afraid to tell her children how deeply alone she really felt. And one sat across from me and said, I feel like I'm disappearing. I looked her in the eye and said, then let's help you find your way back. We cried. We laughed. We sat in a quiet circle and told the truth. And with every word, I could feel the pieces of myself locking into place. Not the woman I once was, but the woman I was always becoming. Emily visits more often now. Sometimes with the kids, sometimes just to sit with me and talk. We've started doing puzzles together, the big, complicated ones with thousands of pieces. I told her, "This reminds me of life. Messy at first, but if you keep showing up, one piece at a time, you find your way." She smiled and said, "You're the strongest woman I know, Mom." I still cry when I hear that. But now it's not because I feel weak. It's because I finally believe her. Alexei hasn't returned. He sent one letter, a short one. No. Apologies, but a quiet acknowledgement. "I'm in therapy. I don't expect anything from you. I just wanted to say I understand now that what I did wasn't love. I'm sorry I hurt you." I cried when I read it. But I didn't write back. I had already closed that chapter, and not in anger, in peace. Some stories don't end with reconciliation. Some end with release. I sit on my porch every evening now, watching the light fade into gold. I let myself feel proud, not because I survived, but because I refused to stay silent. Because I chose myself. That little guest room is now my sanctuary. The garden blooms again. I planted sunflowers there, last spring, big, bold ones, the kind that lean toward the sun no matter how heavy their heads become. Sometimes I whisper to them, "Thank you for growing with me. This house used to feel like a prison. Now, it's a home." Not because someone saved me, but because I stopped waiting to be rescued. I rescued myself. So if you're listening to this, wherever you are, maybe alone in your kitchen, maybe crying in your car, maybe hiding a truth you've carried far too long, I want you to hear this. You are not invisible. You are not weak, and you are not alone. It's never too late to come back to yourself. Not at 73, not at 80, not ever. Because love, real love, doesn't take your voice. It helps you find it. And when you do, speak, stand, shine. You deserve every single bit of light you were born with. Thank you for listening to my story. And if it touched you, please, tell yours. The world needs to hear it.